I'd like to give an argument today about the Salem witch trials. The Salem witch trials argument against the resurrection of Jesus. I'm going to argue that for some reasons principles you already subscribe to, you ought to already be rejecting the alleged resurrection of Jesus. This argument is one of the many arguments from my book, Atheism and the Case Against Christ. It came out from Prometheus Press in 2012. The resurrection is a widely held belief in the United States, globally as well. 78% of Americans are Christians. Another 77% believe that Jesus was executed and then came back from the dead. The resurrection of Jesus is the cornerstone of Christian doctrine. It provides for the Christian salvation scheme, unification with God, atonement, etc. Anybody familiar with the Christian movement knows how central and pivotal the idea that Jesus was resurrected is to the whole religion. Roughly 30 to 35% of Americans are evangelical Christians. Another 30 to 35% are Catholics. So those two groups alone means that over 200 million people subscribe to the view that Jesus literally came back from the dead. For the most part, this view has been adopted uncritically through social, personal, and family channels. Roughly 3/4 of all Americans end up adopting the religious views of their parents, but as we will see, the view that Jesus came back from the dead crumbles when we take a serious look at the evidence and when we compare it to other cases where there hasn't been the same level of social indoctrination and motivated reasoning. So why do so many people believe, when you ask them at least, why do so many people believe in the resurrection? And they will report that they believe it because it's in the Bible. 30% of Americans say the Bible is literally true. Another 49% say that it's the inspired Word of God. So people are getting their primary source of information from the Bible. We don't really have any other historical documents or sources that corroborate the resurrection. So the Bible's the place to get it. But of course, the problem is that being in the Bible isn't enough any more than being in a Spider-Man comic proves that Spider-Man exists. An argument for the reliability of the Bible is needed. You can't just have the book alone. So let's call this the Spider-Man problem. If someone justifies a belief with a religious document, then we must have some independent grounds for thinking that what the document says is true. That's why the mere fact that issue 122 says that the Green Goblin dies while fighting Spider-Man, it doesn't follow that the Green Goblin was real or that the Green Goblin is in fact dead. That the document says X is true by itself is never enough to justify it. So what's needed then is some kind of independent corroboration. Now, traditionally, the way this has been done when people try to answer this question is they make what's known as the historical case for Jesus. Now, this argument gets made in many different ways, and lots of different facts are cited, lots of different things are used as part of the evidence. I'll give you a brief snapshot. Our primary source of information here are the four Gospels. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in the New Testament tell us stories, among other things, about the ministry of Jesus and his trial, his execution, and his alleged resurrection. Those four books tell stories that recount allegedly many multiple eyewitness accounts from people surrounding Jesus in these events. It's been argued by people making the historical case for Jesus, that it would have been too difficult to fake the resurrection since Jesus' execution was so public and so many people knew about what was going on. It's been argued that mass hallucinations by so many people who've reported the resurrection would have been impossible. Different people can't all have the same hallucination. If we've got different people making the same sorts of claims, then there must be something independent, something objective, something that they really witnessed that explains the consistency and explains the fact that they're all telling the same story. It's been argued that the witnesses would not have had any ulterior motives, since reporting the resurrection would have gotten them persecuted. It was far too dangerous, and they were putting themselves at great risk by even talking about their belief or recounting this story. They would have gotten themselves in trouble. So many times advocates for the historical argument will insist that the mere fact that they even told the story suggests that they genuinely believed it, that they were committed to it, that they were sure it's true, because it put them at such risk. There's other facts that are cited in order to support the claim. Sometimes it is argued that the fact that so many of Jesus' followers, as we're told in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, gave up their jobs, they gave up their possessions, and they followed him with such utter conviction and commitment, that those facts also support the resurrection of Jesus. We've got other reasons on independent historical grounds to think that the New Testament is reliable. We've found historical corroboration of the reign of Herod, the destruction of the temple, the growth of the early church, and so on. And those lead us to think that maybe this document is a reliable document more generally. So if it tells us other things about what happened with Jesus, then we can trust those too. It's been argued that the Jews could not have come up with the resurrection idea on their own. It was unprecedented and too unusual, too bizarre to have been just made up, or some sort of conspiracy or fabrication. It's also been argued that the reliability of Jewish oral history makes it such that we can trust whatever was passed on through that mechanism, that the practice of rabbis informing, giving their students important information, particularly expounding on the Torah, expounding on the Jewish law, that tradition has already established a high reliability of transmission across generations. So since we can trust it generally for these other sources of information, or in these other instances, we can also trust it for the resurrection stories as well. So while the individual details of the list may differ from advocate to advocate, in general the arguments will cite a number of facts or a number of features of the stories about the resurrection, and then conclude that the best explanation, therefore, overall, is that Jesus was resurrected from the dead. Now, before we can go further with our discussion of the Salem witch trials, we need to know some of the history of the history here. We need to know some of the facts about the documents themselves, how the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were composed, how we came to have these stories, how the Jesus information was transmitted to us. By most people's reckoning, when we talk to New Testament scholars, historians, academics, people working in New Testament history, the widespread consensus, at least among the people who think that Jesus was a real person, the consensus seems to be that Jesus was executed around 35 Common Era. And by most people's reckoning, the standard date that's put on the Gospel of Mark is around 65. So about 30 years later, the first Gospel, Mark, the Gospel according to Mark, was written, and then Matthew, Luke, and John were written 5 to 35 years later after that. Furthermore, Matthew and Luke, it's widely thought, copied their story from Mark and from some other source or sources. Some people have argued that there is one now lost source called the Q source that the authors of Matthew and Luke used to supplement their information from Mark. All three of these accounts, and John as well, all four accounts give a number of important different details about the resurrection, about lots of things going on with Jesus. But nevertheless, we've got these four sources, and they've got this varied history. And the important point to bring out here is that a number of decades pass before some of these stories get written down. It's also thought that the authors of the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were not the actual eyewitnesses. It's widely thought by historians and scholars that probably that there were some people who were present for some of these events, and that they retold those stories. We're not entirely sure how many people these stories passed through before they made it to the authors. And furthermore, we also think that the authors of the four Gospels themselves weren't the actual disciples, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They were authors. We don't know who they were, but their works were attributed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So we've got unknown authors and an unknown number of steps between those authors and the actual events. We don't know how many people the stories passed through from the events to their being recorded. And we also think now that the ending of Mark, starting around chapter 16, which gives us lots of the details about Jesus' returning from the dead, was added to Mark, the original part of Mark, about 125 to 150 years later after the execution of Jesus. Furthermore, we do not have any of the original Gospels. None of the actual documents that those authors wrote survived. The materials they used, the materials they wrote on, weren't of the sort of durable materials that could have survived over the centuries. We have to wait until another 100 or 200 years pass, and many copies of have been made, and people start using materials that themselves would survive down through the centuries, and even those surviving earliest copies date into the 1st and 2nd centuries, and the ones we have there are just fragments. They're rotted away. Many of them are just tiny shreds of pieces with large gaps and large omissions, because there's not much that has survived. And those pieces that we do have are, many of them are under lock and key, preserved in a Vatican vault somewhere where they're carefully taken care of. All right, so there's a number of other interesting and important details about the history of the compiling and the authorship of the Gospels and the New Testament. And I go into a number of those details in my book, but that's enough for this discussion, for us just to see some of the salient points that bear on the question of what sort of information, what sort of evidence do we have in hand about the resurrection of Jesus. Because now I want to turn to this case. What if we apply the same standard of evidence that's been applied to the resurrection of Jesus, that's led some people to think that Jesus was resurrected? What if we apply that to some other cases? What if we apply that to, say, the Salem witch trials? Now, here's a case where between 1692 and 1693, so a few hundred years ago, dozens of people were accused, arrested, stood trial, and were tortured or hanged for sundry acts of witchcraft, possession by devils, and other supernatural ill deeds. The strange behavior of some little girls fed suspicions and started the whole thing, and started the trials. Ultimately, over 150 people were accused. William Phips, the governor of Massachusetts, got involved. A court was established. There were investigators that conducted investigations. Witnesses were put on the stand and carefully cross-examined. Evidence was gathered. Many people confessed. The entire proceedings were carefully documented with thousands of sworn affidavits, court documents, interviews, and related papers. In the end, 19 people, including Sarah Good and Rebecca Nurse, had been sentenced and executed. Now, let's consider the question this way. What if we treat Salem the way we've treated Jerusalem? We need to ask this question. Suppose we approach Salem and the witch trials the way the resurrection has been treated. Suppose the accused at Salem were really witches. Was there real magic at Salem? In fact, I'm going to argue the comparable case for magic at Salem is better than the case for a resurrection in Jerusalem. And here's why. Generally speaking, what can we say about these two cases? Well, in Jerusalem, there were no investigations that we know of. Someone may have investigated the resurrection, but we don't have any account of that. We've just got some reports decades later written by the authors of the Gospels, some of which were copied from each other, that tell us about the resurrection. In Salem, we've got actual thorough and careful investigations where people actively went into and looked at the case and tried to figure out what was really going on, and we have the actual materials from those events. In Jerusalem, we don't have any eyewitness examinations whatsoever, but in Salem, we've got careful, thorough examinations of the alleged witnesses in a court of law. In Jerusalem, we've got hearsay accounts, anecdotal accounts written 20 to 150 years after the alleged events. We don't know who the authors were. We don't know what other sources they might have availed themselves of. We don't know how many steps between the alleged witnesses and the actual authors. In Salem, we've got thousands of the actual primary documents. We've got sworn affidavits, court documents, interviews, and related papers from the actual court cases. In Jerusalem, even if we're being generous, we've got perhaps 4 to 6 independent sources of information that we know of. Mark seems to have derived his information, the author of Mark seems to have derived his information from some source. We don't know how many, but at least there's Mark. Matthew and Luke drew from Mark and perhaps some other source. John tells a slightly different story. Maybe we could add in some vague independent corroboration from Paul, but at the most we're talking about fewer than 10 independent sources of information that we know about. What do we have in Salem? We've got the direct confessions of the actual witches themselves. We've got hundreds of people and sources of information that provide us with corroborating information about what happened. In Jerusalem, Jesus' followers are alleged by the advocates of the historical argument. They say that Jesus' followers are alleged by others 30 years later to be dedicated and convinced. That is, when we get to Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, we get what appear to be sincere, genuine allegations from the disciples of Jesus. Stories about genuine, sincere, committed, dedicated, and convinced people in the Gospels. What do we have in Salem? We've got witnesses testifying with utter conviction under oath in a court that the accused were witches. In the case of Jerusalem, it's alleged that the fear of persecution and death would have discouraged lying, trickery, and falsification, and that lends support to the resurrection case. What do we have in Salem? Well, we've got enormous disincentive to lie, because men would lose their wives, children would lose their mothers, community members would lose their friends. People were taking their neighbors, putting them on trial, finding them guilty of magic, and then putting them to death. There would have been an enormous incentive by people in this community to find out the real facts here, the real truth here, and surely they wouldn't have taken such a thing so lightly as to put someone to death for a mistake, for trickery, for falsification, or for some kind of error. In the case of the New Testament, it's been argued that historical corroborations of other New Testament events lends reliability to the New Testament in general. But of course, the trials and executions in Salem have been thoroughly corroborated with other independent historical sources. We've got no doubt that there were trials and executions and investigations into the Salem witch trials. So we've got far better quality and quantity evidence for thinking that the Salem witch trials happened, and that we can accept and believe the various charges that people made during the trials. In the case of Jerusalem, it's been alleged that these people couldn't have made up a story about something as fantastic as a resurrection. That would have been far too wild for them to imagine. But of course, it'd be crazy to suggest about Salem that so many people could have made up or hallucinated a story as fantastic as these witch allegations. So many people were involved. We've got hundreds of people involved in Salem. So how could it be that they made it up or hallucinated or fabricated this whole thing? It seems outrageous. It's also been alleged in support of the Jesus case that resurrections are very difficult to mistake or fake, but of course witchcraft would have been very difficult to mistake or fake, particularly by people in the 17th century New England. Okay, so as you can see then, we should infer that if the historical evidence supports the conclusion that Jesus was resurrected, since there's so much better evidence, then there's an even better argument that there were real witches in Salem. But of course, that's an outrageous result, because here's the problem. There was no magic at Salem. No one thinks that there was actually black magic happening there. So where do we stand? Well, I'm arguing that no magic in Salem implies that there was no magic in Jerusalem. By any measure of quantity and quality, I've been arguing the evidence for Salem witchcraft is vastly better than the evidence for the resurrection. But there were no real witches at Salem. So that means that Salem shows that an even heavier burden of proof can be met, and it remains unreasonable to believe that anything magical happened in that case. So the result is that no clear-headed, consistent, and reasonable person should accept the resurrection on the historical evidence. And I don't see any way to get around this result. If you don't think there were real witches in Salem, then you shouldn't think that the resurrection really happened. In fact, lots of people already accept a version of this argument. For many people, if they're Christians, they already accept a historical argument just like this for what really happened, for the origins of Islam, Hinduism, Mormonism, Sikhism, Baha'i, Buddhism, and all the other non-Christian religions. For every ancient religion that has a magical, a transcendent, supernatural, miraculous story at its foundation, if you subscribe to another religious movement that excludes those miracles, that is contradictory to those miracles, then you already must think that something natural, like what I've been outlining, has happened in those cases. That's to say, if you're a non-Mormon Christian, you think that something else must have happened when Joseph Smith reports meeting an angel who gave him golden tablets that communicated the Book of Mormon to him. Or you must think that something else was going on when Muhammad reports a story about meeting an angel who tells him, who recites the information that then became the Quran. You already are employing this standard across the board in these other cases that leads you to reject magic in Salem and reject magic in these other religious cases. So if you're going to be reasonable and consistent, you'd have to do the same for Christianity. Now, as I see it, there's really only three possible responses that a person can make to this argument, this comparison that I'm running. The first one's the right one. I think you should conclude that magic didn't happen in either case. You should consistently apply the standards of evidence that you already accept in these other cases. Nothing supernatural happened in Salem or in Jerusalem. But unfortunately, what's going to happen is that many people are going to take one of these other two options. Now, this is a surprising answer, but some people have argued, well, perhaps there was magic in both cases. You might be tempted to lower your standards and say, well, since we've got so much good evidence in Salem, we should conclude that there were supernatural events both in Jerusalem and in Salem. And I call it lowering your standards because I've been arguing that in Jerusalem, the evidence is very poor. It's very remote, it's sketchy, it's tenuous. So if we're going to accept, we're going to move our standard down so low that we accept the resurrection in Jerusalem, we'd also accept Salem and lots of other cases. So this person would have to accept supernatural events in both cases. Or finally, and perhaps more commonly, the third reaction to this argument is that people will argue that there was a miraculous event in Jerusalem, but not one in Salem. And I'm going to call this splitting the cases. Someone might argue that there is some important disanalogy that makes it reasonable to believe in Jesus, but not in witchcraft. All right, so let's consider these last two responses, and I'll explain what problems are entailed with both of those and why you shouldn't accept them. So what about lowering your standards? If you are tempted to say that there must have been magic in Jerusalem and in Salem, now you've lowered your standards to the point where you're going to be forced to allow magic everywhere, because we've got an unbelievable number of comparable cases that meet the Jesus standard. African witch hunts that are happening right now, the Spanish Inquisition, there's lots more historical examples where they allege demon possession and a variety of magical, miraculous events. There are other incompatible religious miracles, many other non-Christian religions. Saudi Arabian witchcraft trials are happening right now. We've got YouTube charlatans, faith healers, con men, spiritualists, seances, miraculous healings, and so on. That is, there are so many allegations of magic or supernatural or miraculous events in our surroundings, in our culture, and so many of them have a substantial amount of evidence in their favor. We've got YouTube videos, we've got lots of people testifying with utter conviction, we've got lots of the sorts of evidence that has been cited in favor of Jesus can be said of these other cases in addition to Salem. So if we lower our standards that much, then we're going to get all kinds of magic as a result. Now, the problem with that is that, first, many of these events are easily revealed as frauds or mistakes. Lots of them, if we look closer, if we investigate, we find out that there's a very high error rate associated with them. That is, that people are prone to be mistaken at a very high rate when they start giving reports about magical, supernatural, or miraculous events. Furthermore, many of these religious miracles are contrary to Christianity. If we lower our standards so much that we accept the historical case for the resurrection, we're also going to be forced to accept a variety of religious miracles that are incompatible with Christianity. You can't consistently accept the unique divinity of Jesus while simultaneously rejecting Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, animism, and a host of other religious views that are incompatible with it. Lowering our standards makes us into gullible and contradictory dupes. We believe in too much magic and too much contradictory magic. So I don't suggest that you give that answer to the Salem witch trials argument. Now, what's the other option? Well, I don't think we should split the cases either. The objection typically goes like this. People will say, well, the two cases are disanalogous. There are features of the Jesus case that make it reasonable to accept the resurrection, but not reasonable to accept witchcraft in Salem. So they say no to witches, but yes to the resurrection. Now, what's wrong with that? Well, what exactly are those features about the Jesus case that set it off, that make it special, that make it unique among all of these historical accounts of witchcraft or of magic or of miracles? What are the features of the Jesus case that give it this special virtue? The problem's going to be that whatever arguments we encounter here, they typically turn out to be ad hoc or special pleading justifications. That is, they make some special exception for the Jesus case that if we were to apply it consistently across the board to other cases, others would come in well. So now we're back to the floodgate problem. Or they amount to special pleading that isn't really motivated on the basis of a general rational principle. More likely what's going on here is motivated reasoning. That someone who believes in the resurrection is trying to cherry pick or select that evidence or those features of the case that will let the Jesus case through while ignoring these other kinds of comparable cases. The belief in the resurrection is motivating the search for evidence rather than the other way around, and that mistake undermines the whole notion that we can make a historical argument in favor of the resurrection. Now, one of the problems with taking this route is that we lack so much information about the Jesus case. We've got so little information about Jesus. Our information is so fragmented, tenuous, and remote from the source. We don't have enough information to say that the same natural explanation wasn't the case at Jerusalem. And here's what I mean. Sometimes people will look at a case like Salem and they will say, clearly the evidence shows that something other than real witchcraft was going on at Salem. They will cite perhaps the rotten rye grain theory that suggests that people were hallucinating or some kind of mass hysteria or some other exotic psychological dysfunction was leading to people's hysteria over witches, and they will use the large body of evidence that we have concerning Salem in order to support that natural explanation. Now, the problem is in the Jesus case, we don't have very much information. Much of our account of Jesus is dark, gappy, and the details aren't filled in. So if we use some of this extra information in the Salem case to argue that a real natural explanation is what was going on there, we can't know, because we have so little information about Jesus, that perhaps something else, something like that was happening there. We just don't know enough to say that that didn't happen in that case as well. So the small amount of information about Jesus is undermining the person who would split the cases. You want to argue that there's some special features of Jesus, but there's just not much to be said about the Jesus case because there's so little and such poor information. The problem, as I have argued, is that the cases are comparable in the important ways, and we have so much more and such better evidence about Salem. The result then is that you ought to conclude that there was no resurrection and there were no witches. That's to say, you already don't believe in Jesus. You didn't believe it before, you just hadn't consistently applied the same principles. The principles and the good sense that lead us to conclude that there were no real witches at Salem, and in many other cases, are sound. You should stick to those principles. Those principles and our good sense already show us that Jesus was not resurrected and that Rebecca Nurse did not actually cast any magical spells. We should not believe that Jesus came back from the dead.